Welcome to Stitch in Time. My name is Michael Lianos, and my mission is to make sewing approachable to the hobbyist. Today's project will be beginning assembly of your collared shirt, doing front, the yoke, and the back. See you at the ironing board. The nice thing about sewing is that you can take out a project or put it away as many times as you want. If you have 30 minutes to work on something or an hour to work on something, you can do that, put it away, and bring it out again when you're ready to work on it. Every time you bring out your sewing project, you need to hit the ironing board. However, in shirt assembly, the first couple of things that you need to do involve the iron, and I want to show you some specific things to help you in your process. I want to be clear that I'm not working towards a very specific pattern in getting you an end product that matches this end product. What I'm hoping to do is fill in the blanks during the pattern that the pattern may not explain, or the pattern may not be so helpful to you in getting the end product. So the first step with ironing is you want to look at the front panels of your shirt. And some of them are exactly identical. In this pattern, they're identical. Some of them are different. The left side is slightly different from the right side. So you want to consult your pattern for whatever it recommends. I would have the right sides facing down. So the side that you want the shirt to show is sitting on the ironing board. The part that's facing up, facing me, is the part that is going to be against my body when I wear the shirt. So if you set up these patterns in this way, you won't get confused left side from right side, and you won't end up looking like a Picasso painting at the end. So I've set it up how I want it, and so I'm going to take one of the shirt pieces without flipping it or any of that sort of stuff, moving it on the side so I can focus on ironing the other piece, and I just slide this onto the ironing board to be more secure, and I give it a full iron. And then this pattern, how it works, it wants me to fold this end in and this end in again and iron it down. So that's precisely what I'm going to do, and I'll see you on the other side. My cloth is being a little stubborn on the wrinkly department. This is 100% cotton. So one way with 100% cotton or 100% linen to get some of these wrinkles out is to give it a light misting and then iron again. When folding this piece over like I told you the pattern recommended for me to do, one thing that helps keep it nice and straight, I've gotten to a point where I'm pretty good at eyeballing it. But if you're just in the beginning stages, take a seam gauge or a similar measuring device and just keep it set to the length up here in the top where it recommends in your pattern. As I said, always consult your pattern first and keep the seam allowance or the fold over amount the same all the way down until the end. When you've got this to where you want it to be, then give it another press. My pattern says to fold it over again, and there we go. Here's the second time folding it over. Again with the gauge, and here we are. Now without adjusting or twisting or any of that sort of stuff, I'm going to need to sew a seam right along here as my pattern recommends. And so I'm going to keep this in its position on the side, keeping the front panels as you would wear them. That way I don't get confused through the process. If I start moving them around and doing all sorts of weird things with them, then I get confused and my shirt begins to look like a Picasso painting. So I'm going to go iron the other side and see you at the sewing machine. Now I'm back at the machine. I still have my fabric pieces as I would wear them. So the part that would sit on the body are facing up, and the side that everyone's going to see is facing down towards the table. This helps me keep the fabric pieces in order, and this helps me not mess it up and have a Picasso shirt in the end. Now my pattern recommends I sew along this little edge here on both of the front pieces, so I'm going to pin and do that. Why I'm pinning on this is because depending on your sewing machine, it may have the slight tendency to pull the under fabric just a hair, and so the top piece would slightly push out and you'd get this sort of roll and curl as you sew, and that's not good. So the pins help keep that part of your machine and the fabric in check. So I'm going to pin and we'll get started. Now this fabric, as I said, is 100% cotton. Pinning is 100% okay. Once the pins come out, no damage is done to the fabric. However, there are some fabrics out there that a pinning like this would totally destroy the fabric, and in the front where people would see it the most. In that case, I would actually use binder clips. So let's get stitching. I'm using black thread. I would recommend you use whatever thread matches your fabric. The black thread is so you can see all the stitches I make and what I do with them. So let me get stitching. Machine on. Fabric in. Doing what's called an edge stitch. The edge stitch is just how it sounds. It's right along the edge. I put the needle into the fabric and I stitch forward a couple, backward a couple, and all the way up. The edge stitch is done. See how the black shows up against the white? That is why I wanted to use black thread. Please take your time. You have my permission. There's no sewing police that are going to sit there with an egg timer judging you on how fast you're stitching. Taking your time and getting the seam right is actually what's going to work best. Let me repeat this step with the other front piece, and then I'll see you at the end. You guessed it, here we are back at the iron. What we wanted to do is meld the stitches, which means we set them in with the iron so that they lock in nice, and you just make sure everything is flat and where you want it to be. And you do that for both sides and then get the other pattern pieces ironed. And I'll see you back at the sewing machine. Another interesting nugget is to keep track of the right sides and the wrong sides, the sides that are facing on the inside of the fabric and the outside of the fabric. You can take a piece of chalk, if it's not already apparent, and you can actually mark X's on the side that you want on the inside towards your body. And this actually helps you keep track of some of the assembly, because pretty soon it's going to get confusing, and that's okay. I'll help you walk through it. So I got these X's marking which side is which, and I'm doing this after ironing because ironing sometimes will fade out these X's. So the next step is these are called the yoke. You start pinning these to the back side of the shirt. And for me, it doesn't matter which one is the first one. I usually like to do the inside one first. So I would have the inside of the back of the shirt facing up, and then the inside of the yoke facing up. So that would be right side to wrong side, if you will. And then I just pin this edge. And then the very first seam, I don't do on the regular seam allowance, I do in from the seam allowance. This pattern tells me the seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. So I do a little stitch at 3/8 of an inch. And I do what's called a basting stitch, which is actually a larger stitch. Your machine will have a knob with settings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Some of them have a 5. I go all the way to 4. What those length numbers mean is millimeters, and so that larger 4mm stitch goes across this first one to hold it in. So let me pin and let's get started on that seam. Now the trick with a basting stitch is you don't have to backstitch and lock it in, because there's going to be another stitch that's coming along that takes care of that business and make sure everything's nice and neat. Now that our seam is basted, let's work on the other piece. Now, a lot of you may be wondering, Michael, all this ironing and you're skipping ironing now? Yes. This basting stitch is not a permanent stitch. With this particular pattern, it didn't require any pleats. It wanted me to ease some of the material into the yoke facing, so this distance in the back was ever so slightly larger than the yoke, and it was a round seam on the back, whereas the yoke is a nice straight seam. So part of that easing needed to happen, and that's why I did a basting stitch, and that holds everything together so that when I put this piece on, it's nice and easy peasy. So I pin this on and I do a normal stitch. Now when you get back to stitching, always, always, always double, triple, quadruple check to make sure your stitch length has been readjusted. I can't tell you how many times I've gone and been disappointed in this seam because I didn't check. Always make sure the layers under all the fabric are nice and smooth as you're stitching. Now that you're done the seam, inspect both sides, the underside to make sure there are no wrinkles, make sure it's nice and straight, checking the underside over here, making sure there are no wrinkles or bunches. If everything seems okay, you've done a successful stitch. See you over at the ironing board. Here we are back at the ironing board. Now with this step, after sewing, you may have a slight curve in your fabric, and as you can see with mine, my fabric doesn't exactly want to sit flat. So the trick is to get this stitched part flat and let the rest of the shirt curl up and do whatever it does. But I would make sure this part is flat and feel with your fingers on the ironing board that there are no wrinkles, and then I would just hit the iron along the seam, and that's it for this step. Because we've ironed the shirt a bunch of times, most everything should be fine. We're just locking in the stitches, called melding, and so that should be good. Now the next step, we are going to be attaching the front pieces to the back piece. So right here you can see some of the blue marks. The back of the shirt is facing me, so this is the inside of the shirt. I would just touch up these top edges because that will be the next point where we attach. But before we do anything with stitching up here, I want to show you a neat little trick with this piece called it's called grading your seams, because sometimes when you get to a point where you're ironing in your shirt, you don't want to necessarily see that line, and if you leave it just like this, you're going to get a nice harsh line right about where your seam allowance is. So my recommendation is to grade your seams so that one of them is a little bit longer than the other, so you get this sort of ramp effect, and so that there's no harsh line when you iron the end product. So let me go get the scissors and I'll be back to grade the seams. Wow, my shears appeared magically. I have pinking shears and then the snips. Usually I'll pink just outside of the basting seam, and then I'll cut this leftover fringe down a little closer. So let's get clipping. Now that we're pinked, I take this other seam in on the inside of that basting seam, usually between the basting seam and the real seam. Now our seams are graded. So I would go again and iron this piece where we just melded the seams. I would give it another hit with the iron. Now in this step, you want to start bringing these up. So I would make sure the bottom yoke is nice and flat, and I bring the top yoke over, and I sort of give it a nice little push. I'll put these scissors over on the side. I give it a nice little push as I come along the seam, because as I mentioned, there's some curve to this fabric, and that's okay. It's designed to be that way. So I give it a slight little push, and then sometimes I come the other direction. But this one, the cloth is behaving for once, and so I just keep going to the end. Now this yoke is up, and I can see the seam is holding really nicely. No wrinkles or crinkles or any of that stuff. Now from the other side, I then pull the yoke up and I do the same. I make sure I do the same process. So this yoke is nice and up and taut, and then this one comes up over it, and I do a nice little pressing motion to make sure the seam is open and together nicely against the back. And again, you sometimes gotta adjust and go a little bit at a time to make sure you got it right. Now with that correct, I give the back another touch-up iron, especially right here where we've been messing around with the cloth. Now that this is pressed, now that these edges are nice and pressed, back to the table and the sewing machine. Now that we're back at the table and the machine, as you can see the back side of the shirt, this is the outside of the shirt, or the right side, and then the wrong side is on the inside, the side that's going to be against the skin of your body. So this is the blue marks. Over here next to this, I have my front pieces, where the outside is facing the table and the inside is facing up towards me. So what I want to do is take these pieces and slide them over, go on top of the back of the shirt, so that you have what they call the right sides facing each other. So this is going to be on the outside of the shirt, this is going to be on the outside of the shirt, they're touching each other and facing each other. Next step, I want to just pin along here to make sure these are attached to the top piece, only one piece of this. You don't want to sew all 3 layers yet. You want to just sew the top two, and what I do is I put a little baste here, which is that long stitch, and I do right across here and then right across here and then on to the next step. So let me pin and see you at the machine. Now that we're all pinned up, I want to reiterate some things. The back of the garment that you want to see is facing the front of the garment that you want to see. We're going to stitch it this way. We're eventually going to inside it out. So that's how that's going to work. So the right sides are facing each other. Notice these blue lines that I marked on the wrong sides, they're facing up. And then if I lift up, you can see the blue on the back of the shirt. And when you pin, you don't want to pin both yokes, you just want to pin one of them. So let me adjust my stitch length to the longer length that we've talked about. And let's do a quick stitch up here. I usually do less than the seam allowance. My seam allowance in this pattern is 5/8 of an inch, so I'm only going to do 3/8 for the basting stitch. And I'm not going to back stitch with the basting. Needles in, pin out, and I just go straight across. Now that I'm at my edge and I'm not going to be back stitching on this basting stitch, I can get my other piece of fabric ready, and I'm going to go one right into the other. So I stitch right over the edge of this cloth, and then I bring the needle up again, press her foot up, and we're right into the next cloth. This will save you some thread. It'll also save you some time. As always, you want to make sure that everything's smooth and straight and feeding in the machine exactly as you want it to. Now that you're basted, make sure to clip all of the threads. And let's move over to the side a little bit to show you the next tricky step. Our threads on the ends have been clipped, and now this is the tricky part. So we lift this up, see how you get the yoke and the yoke facing open? This is how you want it in the back. And then you just lay that down, making sure you have one yoke facing up, one yoke facing down on the table. Then I position this seam sort of how I want it, because you don't want a lot of moving around with that. And then I do one fold, and then I bring these in a little bit, and I just roll. This is what I call the shirt burrito. And you know what? There's more than one way to do this particular method. Some people will sew it in a different way. That's okay. This is not the only way to skin this cat. Sorry kitties, sorry PETA people. It's an old saying. This is not the only way to do it. However, it's the way I do it and the way that works for me. And I just pin all along this side and this side. See you at the machine. Now that you have the shirt burrito prepared, you need to make sure on your machine that your stitch length is back to your normal size. Don't forget to always check that before you start sewing, because there are so many times where I get through a seam and I go, oh, I have to redo the whole thing. So, in order to save yourself that ripping out and starting over again, I would always double check. Make sure things are set in how you want them to start. Needle in the fabric. Couple stitches forward, couple stitches backwards, and away we go. that we're on the edge, a couple of things to caution. On this end and on this end, as you can see, it's pretty close. One of the risks with this method is that you have the potential to catch the whole shirt into the seam. And that's, for some people, enough of a deterrent to do it. For me, I get the best end product from this because everything lines up perfectly and it's nice and straight and smooth. And for me, this one works. I also, with this method, have the opportunity to grade the seams. So remember what we did over here with the grading of the seams? I do that again on this side. So to spare you seeing that 100 times, I'm going to hit the iron and come back for the next step. As you can see, I ironed the edges here, I clipped them and graded the seams, and I didn't iron this part in the middle because that's gonna come out now. So what has happened is we've sewed all of the inside seams, and now our job is to inside it out. So very slowly and gently, I pull everything out. Sometimes it needs some encouragement from the other end to go in. The whole idea is this goes inside out. Sometimes it comes through the neck, which is okay. You can go that direction. This one wants to go through the neck, so that's what I did. And see how all of those seams that were on the outside are now on the inside and ready to iron here. Now, some people have their preference on outside seams. They like the look of an edge stitch. So some people will put a stitch alongside this edge here and this edge here and this edge here, and that's a nice touch. But as this video is your first collared shirt, I'm going to keep it simple like this. So that's what we're going to do. And we have our front and our back all stitched together. I hope this was helpful and inspired you to sew. If you have specific questions and concerns about this portion of a shirt pattern, put them below and I'll try and address those and see if I can upload maybe a mini video to help you through those moments in your first collared shirt. Again, this is Stitch in Time. My name is Michael Lianos. Thank you for joining me in this video. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.